Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, April 27th, 2006. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, on this week's podcast, we learn a bit about brewing like a monk. In fact, we're joined by the author of a book of that same title to give us some insight. Stan Hieronymus is author of Brew Like a Monk, Trappist, Abbey, and Strong Belgian Ales, and How to Brew Them. We talked to him about his book, and he lets us in on some of the techniques he learned while doing research in Belgium. On those same lines, while I'm thinking about it, a couple of my podcasting buddies have done episodes recently on the subject of Belgian and Belgian-style ales. A couple of weeks ago, the guys at Big Foamy Head cracked open a few Trappist ales. You can hear their take on the Belgian beauties at bigfoamyhead.com. Also this week, the guys at Craft Beer Radio tasted Belgian-style beers from Unibrew. I haven't had time to listen to that episode yet, but you can find it at craftbeerradio.com. I'm waiting to see if the Pacific Brew News radio guys will do a Belgian show, and I know that Rick is planning a brewery tour of Russian River Brewing, and they do some wonderful Belgian-based beers there, so check back at pacificbrewnews.com to see when that will be. Well, I have some great news to pass on about one of our recent guests. If you'll remember, Kevin DeLange joined us a few weeks ago to talk about mini-mashing. Well, his brewery, Dry Dock Brewing Company in Aurora, Colorado, has been awarded gold in the special bitter category at the World Beer Cup. Kevin writes, I was there and very surprised when they announced it. As they announced Victory ESB, my first thought was, who stole our beer name? And then they said from Dry Dock Brewing Company. Kevin says this will be a huge shot in the arm for a startup brewery. Well, that's exciting. Very good news for Kevin and Dry Dock as they're just getting off the ground with their new brewery. Congratulations, guys. Speaking of mini-mashing, Larry from Laguna Niguel, California, has a different take on mini-mashing from what we talked about with Kevin. Instead of using grain bags, Larry adds his grain straight into his mashing pot, then scoops out the grains into a big colander. He then strains the rest of the mash water through the grains, or sparges it through there, and sparges through the grains into the brew pot for about 20 minutes. Larry believes this method would be more efficient at extracting fermentables than just using the bags. Well, that sounds good to me. There's probably a trade-off, more effort, it sounds like, but probably better efficiency. If you do mini-mash with grain bags, you should probably use the biggest bags you can find to make sure that the water can get in there and activate those enzymes properly. Soil Boy writes from Burton-upon-Trent in England on taking speed brewing a step or two further than we talked about with Chris Colby last time. Soil Boy writes, apart from brewing, one of my other passions is hiking and camping in the wilderness. Several trips we have done have been over a week, which means that you have to travel pretty light so that you're able to carry enough food. No such luxuries as beer. If only I could enjoy a couple of beers outside my tent surrounded by nature after a hard day's hiking. Soil Boy says, I had a brainwave. How about brewing out in the wilderness? The brew would have the following constraints. Brewing time should be minimal. Weight should be minimized. No extra equipment and lightweight ingredients. Soil Boy says, I did a bit of research on the internet and came up with the following. Collect and purify some stream water for your batch using a filter pump. Mix with dried malt extract. Bring to the boil in a saucepan on a campfire or stove. Add the desired amount of drops of isomerized hop extract. Cool and pour into an empty wine bag. Shake to oxygenate. Add the correct amount of turbo yeast for your batch size. Wait. After 24 hours, filter off the spent yeast, hold your nose, and drink. He says the result, unsurprisingly, was hideous. The sight of it was enough to make me sick, and I was only able to take a small sip. Well, that's a shame. He says, do you think this approach would ever be feasible? How would I improve the flavor? Do you have any tips apart from an airdrop? Which to me sounds like maybe the best idea. In the end, it's probably just as easy and no doubt lighter to take a hip flask of whiskey. I hope that I haven't upset any brewing purists with this idea, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Well, I have to applaud Soil Boy's ingenuity, and I bet with a little experimentation he might be able to improve his overnight outdoor brew. I suggested he make sure his gravity was fairly low if he's wanting fermentation to be anywhere near complete in 24 hours. You'd also want to make sure that the wine bag is warm enough for the yeast to work quickly, I would assume. Any thoughts? If so, be sure to write them to james@basicbrewing.com or use the contact form on basicbrewing.com. Martin from the UK writes, just thought I would let you know that the DVDs and the T-shirt arrived safe and sound in the UK this morning, and that I am over the moon with them. I watched most of both discs already and think they are the Dogs Watsits, which means rather good in case you're not sure. And I wasn't sure. I've never heard of the Dogs Watsits. Martin says, I'm of the opinion after watching them and listening to your radio cast that you seem to quite enjoy yourself whilst doing them, maybe getting some help from a little liquid refreshment along the way. Well, usually not on the audio podcast because I'm usually here by myself, and if I have liquid refreshment during the audio podcast recording, it's usually coffee. But Steve and I do, we're brewing buddies and we're good friends, and a few beers maybe during the video podcast recording certainly encourages a little fun. So there you go. I thought that note was funny, so I thought I'd share it with you. I'm going to start saying Dogs Watsits around the house. Hey, good job, son. That's the Dogs Watsits you did on that thing there. By the way, Martin wants to do a show about gadgets, and that's a popular request that I get, and it's one that I'm working on. So thanks for the note, Martin. I've had a lot of good email recently, and I really appreciate all the support and feedback that I'm getting, and I'm really happy so many of you enjoy the show and get so much out of it. And also, by the way, I got a listener who put a spot on the map in Chile, so that's our first South American pushpin on the Frapper map. Very interesting. I want to remind you that National Homebrew Day is coming up on May 6th. The American Homebrewers Association is encouraging you to take part in a big brew where brewers across the country are going to be sharing the fun of homebrewing. You can find out more at beertown.org. Also, next week, Tony Simmons, author of the recipe for Poor Richard's Ale, will be joining us. Poor Richard's Ale is one of the recipes the AHA is suggesting to brew on May 6th. And I've already recorded that interview, and it was a lot of fun to talk to Tony. Now, on to another fun interview. Warmer temperatures have had me thinking about brewing Belgian beers lately, so I picked up a copy of Brew Like a Monk, Trappist, Abbey, and Strong Belgian Ales and How to Brew Them. And, since I do this little podcast deal, I called up Stan Hieronymus, the author, to talk about the book and to get some tips firsthand. Stan Hieronymus, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thanks. I'm glad to be talking to you.
First of all, the subject for your book, Brew Like a Monk, Trappist, Abbey, and Strong Belgian Ales and How to Brew Them, it just had to be a torturous research phase for the book. Was it not? I mean, going to Belgium and experiencing all the settings and drinking all the beers just had to be torturous. Well,
quite honestly, it was almost all fun, except for driving in Brussels.
So driving in Brussels was the hard part.
I would not recommend it, but it's very hard. If you want to go see the various parts of Belgium, public transportation is not going to get you everywhere.
So did you hook up with locals and to help you navigate?
Well, I got lost many times because we rented a car. For instance, the shortest way to go from Westmalle to Aachen means going through the Netherlands. And I had very nice directions, except they put a detour on the way.
Well, there you go. Now, first of all, your book kind of erased some misconceptions that I had going into it. When I thought of Belgian or Trappist beers, I had this image, probably because of the pictures on the bottles, of monks dressed in robes, tending ancient brewing equipment and, applying a sort of religious dedication to producing these quality beers and not saying a word, while they're doing it. But what is the reality of the Trappist beers?
Well, there are 6 Trappist breweries in Belgium. At the time I wrote the book, a 7th brewery in the Netherlands, which is La Trappe, also known as Koningshaven, had been a Trappist brewery, was not allowed to use the Trappist stamp, is again allowed to use the Trappist stamp. But today we'll talk about the Belgian members of the family. Of those 6, in 3 of them, the largest, Westmalle, Chimay, and Orval, monks have no working role in the brewery. At Aakel, which is the newest and the smallest, one monk sort of oversees things when the traveling brewer who comes and brews there isn't around, but his role is rather small. At Rochefort, they're a little bit more involved, would continue to be involved, but Brother Antoine, who used to oversee brewing, retired. The same thing's true at Westmalle. Brother Thomas was immensely important at Westmalle for more than 40 years, but when he retired, there was nobody to take his place, and a secular brewer took over. Only at Westvleteren are the monks directly involved with brewing, oversee the brewing operation, and everything else. And again, that's the smallest brewery and the least modern. It's the only one using open fermentation, for instance. Generally, the monastery breweries, they pride themselves in having very modern equipment, in having laboratories, and in the quality of their product.
And they are commercial endeavors. I mean, they make no bones about the fact that they are trying to make a profit.
Yeah, but that profit is going to charitable contributions. Chimay is in a very poor area. They add more than 80 jobs to the economy, and then again, they also support other charitable areas. Westmalle is the second largest contributing Trappist monastery funds to Rome. So that money is going. It's not going as dividends to some investors.
Right. Well, it's going as dividends to good causes.
Right.
Now, how would you, when we talk about these beers, these Trappist, Abbey, and Strong Belgian Ales, how would you characterize them? What sets them apart from other styles of beer?
Well, generally speaking, obviously there are differences within the family. When you talk about Orval, it's entirely different than the other beers as you drink it in the United States because of the Brettanomyces that comes through, which wine drinkers would consider a souring agent, but that gives it that pineapple-y and tart character. But for the most part, these beers are stronger, and one thing that we don't generally think about, you drink it and you say, wow, that's different, is they're very well attenuated beers. They don't have lots and lots of body. So you can drink this beer that is 7, 8, 9% and not feel bloated and probably have another.
Is it fair or is it useful to lump these beers together into a rigid style? I mean, the style, I guess, pretty much, the description of the style pretty much grew up around the beers as they kind of grew sort of organically, right?
Yeah, it rather than, for one thing, there is the Trappist logo on the bottles that says that this is from a Trappist monastery. The monks have control over the product. And in that way, you're not thinking about its style like saying it should be 6.5 to 7.5%. You're thinking about where it comes from and how authentic it is. And that's a fair way to talk about Trappist. It's easier for us when you're Americans and you think in terms of style, to say it's a double or it's a triple or it's a strong dark ale. Most of them fit in those categories.
Now, a number of breweries here in the United States have started brewing what they call Belgian-style ales, and as Americans tend to do, they put their own spin on the style. What is your impression of how these American breweries have interpreted the Belgian styles?
Well, last week I moderated a panel at the Craft Brewers Conference with 4 Belgian brewers on it, as a matter of fact, from Orval, Westmalle, Duvel, and St. Bernardus. And at the end, I asked them to talk to the Americans about their impressions of the beers they were tasting, because the World Beer Cup was judged at the same time. And many Americans were not happy with what they heard. Because most American interpretations of a triple, for instance, are much sweeter than the Belgian styles. And one Belgian brewer said, I can't drink more than one of these. It's too sweet, it makes my stomach hurt. And the American brewers were upset to hear this. And during the course of the week, the Belgians would say, there's a lot of this, a lot of that isn't taking place in Belgium. On the other hand, I think some American brewers are taking inspiration from the Belgian beers they've tasted and creating something that is distinctly American. The people who are not trying to copy directly are making great new products. Very few people are having success trying to duplicate, say, a Rochefort 10, a Westvleteren 12, or even the St. Bernardus Opt 12. There are some good strong darks out there, but if you're just trying to copy a Belgian beer, you're going to have a harder time.
Now, Brew Like a Monk is not a recipe book, and it's not kind of a technical book like designing great beers, although there's some aspects to that. And there are a few recipes in the back, but they are kind of more like guidelines and serve more as a reference, the way I look at it, to build your own recipes. How would you describe your approach in this book to the topic of Belgian ales?
Well, my interest was, and in fact, it takes inspiration from designing great beers, which has no recipes in it, to say that this is the way the classic producers do it. And I, of course, was astonished with what the brewers in Trappist monasteries would tell me. They may not speak specifically about recipes, but they answered many of the questions that haven't been answered before about things like fermentation management and yeast sources, those sorts of things. So you get that information, and they'll talk about what ingredients they're using, maybe not the exact measurements. I think armed with that information, with tasting the beers and knowing what you want, that you should be writing your own recipes. If you're trying to duplicate Westmalle Duvel, then you can go for that. If you want to do something that's a little bit different in your own take, then you're free to do that as well. Ultimately, I would always tell people that you should brew like yourself and for yourself.
Yeah, I guess if you did a Google search for a clone recipe of those Trappist beers, you'd probably find a bunch of pages out there of people with their own interpretations. So, there's no scarcity of recipes out there. But I think what your book does is give the history and kind of culture of the styles, and then in the back, you talk about the kinds of ingredients, the kinds of balances and such that they use, and I would feel, I think, more confident in designing my own recipe after reading that than just looking at someone's interpretation of a strict recipe with strict ingredients and measurements and things like that.
I also think that people are, if you look at what's involved in most Belgian recipes, certainly in the Trappist, but of course one of the simpler ones, Duvel, which is just Pilsner malt, sugar, and 2 hops, that you realize their recipes are much simpler. And an important thing amateur brewers should recognize is that most commercial recipes are much simpler.
Yeah, simplicity is it seems to be one of the main rules in formulating one of these recipes. Let's start getting into the nuts and bolts. What kinds of ingredients are we looking at if we're going to make a Belgian ale?
Well, obviously, like all beers, the largest ingredient is water, and in part because the monasteries that Michael Jackson had access to in his early days of writing the World Beer Guide, and other times he's written about Belgian beers, and his book, The Great Beers of Belgium, is now in its 5th edition, and the newest edition is always worth getting. He talks about soft water, and he talks about really good water. In the case of Belgians, they meant pure water. Orval and Rochefort, their water is high in bicarbonate, and they don't make a whole lot of adjustments. In the case of Rochefort, when they're mashing, they're at that way high end of the pH, what we would consider the high end of the pH, and then bring it down in the kettle using lactic acid. So you don't have to have really soft water. This is certainly something whenever people are brewing. If you're trying to clone a recipe, I guess you do that. Over the course of your life, if you say, this is what my water is like, and these are the adjustments I'm going to make, which is what they do at Rochefort, then you're going to be happier with your beer. Beyond that, base malt is a Pilsner malt, continental Pilsner malt, and that's the really important element of all of them. When we think about the color in those beers, much of the color comes from the sugar that's available in Belgium and has not previously been available in the United States. But they are using, caramel malts, Cara Munich, and Cara Vienna. The source for most of them is Dingemans, and that malt's available in the United States.
And in using specialty grains, it sounds like you don't want to get overboard with selecting a bunch of different specialty grains for your recipe. It sounds like to me in reading the book, again, simplicity is the key in adding those flavors and those colors.
Well, again, back to Rochefort, as a monk who used to be involved with brewing there said they use 2 grains, they use 2 sugars, meaning a light sugar and a dark sugar, 2 hops, and 2 yeast, and that's a reference to the fact that their yeast has 2 pretty distinct strains in it, and it actually has kind of a third little offshoot. But that's it. It's in their case, it's a Pilsner malt, Cara Munich, light and dark sugar, and then you with the hops, everybody is using noble low alpha hops. And
the bitterness unit to a gravity unit ratio, as Ray Daniels puts it, is fairly low, right? You're not talking about hoppy beers.
It's going to be fairly low, particularly in the darker beers. Now, Westmalle Triple is 38 BUs, and Westmalle does a beer for the monks that's bottled for the monks there, and at Ockel and occasionally slips out, called Westmalle Extra, which is all Pilsner malt, no sugar. It's about a 5% beer, and it's about 30 BUs. Brother Thomas, who's when we're talking about ingredients, of course, we haven't talked about the yeast yet. The Westmalle yeast is used at Westvleteren, Westmalle, and Ockel. Ockel and Westvleteren come get the yeast from Westmalle the days they're brewing, and that is incredibly fresh, viable yeast. I mean, it's literally shoveled out of the fermenters and ready to go. It's just, to walk in there and see these guys throwing yeast through the air and smell it is just incredible. And so that they're all using that same yeast.
And what kinds of characteristics do you get from that yeast?
Well, in the lighter colored beers, you can obviously it's the fruit up front, like pears and apples, maybe a little bit of like tangerines and even some strawberry quality, and then a spiciness. If you're hitting that right balance of of the phenolics and the esters from the yeast, which comes down to fermentation management. In the darker beers, once you add in dark sugar and a little bit of malts, then you get back down to more like the darker quality, which are the raisins, the plums, the figs, prunes, those sorts of things. And again, though, you still expect to get a peppery quality as well.
Mentioning pepper brings us into the subject of spices. With a few exceptions, the perceptions of the spiciness of these beers is not from spices, right?
It's not from spices at all. Chimay put some spices in their monk's beer called Doré, which we don't get in the United States. And people who are coriander bigots will tell you they can taste the coriander in Rochefort. I don't think you can, and I think at this point the brewing engineer at Rochefort, were he allowed to make a change in the recipe, would drop the coriander out altogether. It's not a factor in the beer. It is used in other breweries. For instance, Triple Carmelite, a very popular beer in the United States from Bastille's, uses a variety of spices. And by adding a little bit of coriander at the end, that's been a solution for brewers who have not been able to get the same attenuation and finish as the Abbey monasteries do, or the Abbey breweries, or somebody like Duvel. Duvel's 93% attenuated.
Wow. Is that a function of, at least in part of the sugar?
It's a function of the sugar and a function of these yeasts. These are great attenuating yeasts. When you're working with them, you can get frustrated, particularly if you use one of the yeast sourced from Duvel, whether it's Y yeast or White Labs. The yeast doesn't flocculate very well, and you got to be really patient with it, and give it a longer cooling time, or even like Duvel, drop it below zero for a few weeks to get some of the yeast dropped out of it. But fermentation at Duvel takes place over only 5 days, and they're going to be at about as close to terminal gravity as they're going to get.
Wow.
And they begin, they pitch at, they've just, Hedvig Nevin, the director of brewing, was on this panel, and he brought a chart with new figures, as a matter of fact. So, they'll pitch at 19 to 20 C, which is in the 60s. And by day 2, they're going to be at 25 C, which again is like the mid to higher 70s. And at day 3, they're going to be above 80 in terms of fermentation temperature. And that's all taking place based upon essentially the energy created during the fermentation. They aren't raising any temperatures around it. In fact, sometimes they're reining it in.
Now that leads to my next question. One reason why I wanted to get your book now and to talk to you now is because one of my goals this summer is to do some Belgian beers. And we've discussed a lot on the show about the brewing with the seasons, doing lagers in the winter and ales, maybe in the springtime and Belgians in the summertime. What role does the fermentation temperature play? I mean, what if you let your fermentation go up into the 80s, which would be around the upper 20s in Celsius? What kinds of characters does that bring out, and what does that do to your beer?
Well, the good things it does is you get the flavors we talked about. The bad things that happen are if you let it ramp up too fast, too early, then you're going to get a lot more clove-like phenols, because these Belgian yeasts operate much like the German Hefeweizen yeast. And when, as a matter of fact, Y yeast did a rather complete study of this. And if you create, if you start with a wort with like 40% wheat, and you use these yeast and let them operate at a high temperature, you're going to get a Hefeweizen. And additionally, because they are such good attenuators, they just throw off all kinds of higher alcohols, and you're going to get a headache beer. So you're going to get yucky phenolics and yucky, I hate to use those scientific terms, esters. So a key, and I don't want to, I mean, there are good reasons to do this in the summer, but you have to be able to control the temperature, particularly early on. So you don't, if you look at, and it's really using suggestions from the yeast manufacturers, you should throw those out the door. You know, they're putting fail-safe temperatures on it. They say this operates this way in this range. You know, both of them for the book provided nice little charts that talked about what characteristics you get at different temperatures, and I think that's a good way to look at it. In the case of white, it's also available at their website, and Y yeast, I think it's hidden somewhere at their website. You don't have to buy the book. But if you look and see what's happening in the low 60s, what happens in the mid-60s to the 70s, and what happens at higher temperatures, then you can get a feel for why you like your beer to move through all of that, but at different points in the stage of fermentation. So back to your question, if you can pitch your yeast at, say, 62 Fahrenheit, like about 16 to 18 C, so if you can get your work cooled down to that, and keep it in a relatively cool place, so it's mostly the yeast taking the temperature up, then there's a good chance you can get to 80% attenuation within the first few days and before the temp gets higher. And then you want those last few degrees of attenuation to take place at the higher temperatures. And a lot of American craft brewers have taken this approach. Pitch low, let it move higher, which is going to happen naturally just because the yeasts are going to generate so much energy. And another thing for a home brewer to recognize is the temperature is not your ambient temperature. And even if you're using, say, a carboy and you put, a temperature strip on the outside, that temperature inside can be like 8 to 10 degrees higher.
Because of the insulation of the glass.
The insulation of the glass and the energy that you're creating. But after, if you're able to control, if you've got a good strong fermentation and it doesn't go crazy on you in the first 2 or 3 days, then those higher temps are going to work very well for you.
So what's your advice? What are good management techniques for homebrewers? Start it out in the basement, maybe, where the temperatures are a little more stable?
Your basement. I live in the Southwest. I have no choice. I need a refrigerator where I'm controlling the temperature. And so an astonishing thing, and I didn't have this figure for the book, is generally craft brewers are pitching at 1 million cells per milliliter per Plato. So you can take a beer like Ommegang, for instance. Ommegang Ale, as brewed in Cooperstown, New York, they pitch 18.5 million cells per mill for Ommegang Ale, which is an 18.5p beer. That beer is currently being brewed in Belgium by Duvel, which owns Ommegang, because Ommegang is expanding, and they just can't make enough beer. At Duvel, they pitch 8 million cells per mill. Much lower rate. An American homebrewer who tries to pitch at those lower rates is just going to get terrible beer. Unless you've got a really great source for viable yeast. The yeast has to be viable, and it has to be fresh. And even making a gigantic starter, you're probably not going to do that. So in a home brewing situation, you want to make sure you pitch enough yeast. It's almost impossible to overpitch. You might lose a little bit of flavor development, but the other bad things that can happen are not worth it. So you want to pitch a good amount of yeast. Try and start it off in the low 60s and control the temp as long as you can. Then if, let's say you're in a basement situation that's actually in the 60s, maybe to finish it off, you want to bring it upstairs. And you really need to make sure that you get that good attenuation, because first of all, the attenuated beer, over time, you'll just find yourself enjoying it more. And the second is the simple act of finishing it off is going to give you those final esters and a little bit of peppery quality and spiciness that you'll enjoy without adding spices.
Now, how important is lagering in a homebrew situation in a secondary fermenter to get that attenuation?
Well, you're going to get most of your attenuation before you go to secondary. You might get a little bit more in secondary. If you can knock it down to really cold, and particularly if you're if you're sourcing from the Chimay yeast, which is White Labs 500 and Y yeast 1214, or trying to do something like Duvel, those yeasts don't flock very well. So if you put them in cold, at least more of it's going to drop out. West Malls kind of is a little bit better. The Rochefort yeast, which Y yeast has generally and White Labs has some of the time, that does flock a little bit better. So you're going to get a cleaner looking beer, which in a triple you're going to care a little bit more about by letting it sit longer. And if you can do that cold, then you're ahead of the game.
Now, if you do that, if you do a lagering stage, is it necessary or advisable to repitch when you're bottling?
Well, almost everybody involved with re-fermentation in the bottle will tell you you're going to need to repitch in almost any conditions. And that's a reason to try and get some yeast dropped out, or if you do a little bit of filtering, it doesn't hurt to filter a little bit of the yeast out, because you want to introduce new, fresh yeast. Re-fermentation in the bottle is a tremendous challenge. In the United States, commercially, Ommegang is probably has the best setup of anybody, and they're totally buried by what takes place at these Belgian breweries. Westmalle, Chimay, Orval, all incredible conditioning rooms. You just walk in, it's a warehouse, and the control they have over the humidity, heat throughout. It's not, if you take your bottles and put them, in a case or something like that, they're not going to get the same temperature. Each one of them's going to get a different temperature. In Belgium, they got it set up so they know the temperature is exactly the same. The fermentation is going to happen quickly. This becomes important because when you re-yeast, you are actually reintroducing a diacetyl problem. So you need a quick fermentation that's going to be complete and gets reabsorbed. And
they've got warm rooms.
They're using warm rooms for that. Now, this is an advantage of doing it in the summer. Naturally, you're probably going to have a room that is 80 degrees, and you can just set it aside there, and it should happen rather quickly.
Yeah, that's called my house.
Yeah. But part of that means that you need to figure out how much CO2 you still have in solution, and because you don't want to put too much yeast in, because it's going to, your beer's not going to look very pretty coming out of the bottle.
Yeah, what levels of priming and carbonation are we looking for?
You're generally going to be looking at about 4 volumes. Just Duvel's more like 4 1/4. Orval, after 6 months, because they had Brettanomyces in the bottle, they're actually at 5 volumes.
Wow!
So that's much higher levels than you will see suggested, and it's a reason to bottle these beers, though. You're just not going to be able to get that carbonation in a keg, and you're not going to be able to dispense it out of a keg.
And you're looking at stronger than standard bottles at that point, right?
Well, for safety purposes, a lot of the American bottles are rated about 2.5 volumes. So that's a good excuse to buy the Belgian beers and save the bottles. Duvel, as a matter of fact, has made in the last 2 years their bottles even thicker and stronger, because they're shipping more away from Belgium And so, they're concerned about when they travel exactly how well they'll do.
Now, I don't think we covered sugar adequately, probably. Now, the sugar, in American homebrewing, there's a kind of a stigma on using sugar, and especially table sugar, in beers because of the fear of getting a cidery taste. But this is a style that it really piles on the sugar.
Yeah, I think one thing that goes back for homebrewers, of course, is when you're using extract. And, of course, when you're using extract, you're never exactly sure what you're starting from.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know how much sugar there is in there. You don't know how fresh your extract is. And then some of what people refer to as cidery in Belgian beers, let's say we're back to an all-grain beer, is actually bad fermentation management. So there are a variety of reasons that people shy away from it. But the fact is that most of the West Malt beers are more than 15% sugar, for instance. Duvel is more than 15% sugar. Rochefort is about 15% sugar. Westphal Run they won't say, but I think it's 15 to 20% sugar. So they have a good percentage of sugar, which gives your yeast, again, the chance to get that better attenuation. Because they don't have to work as hard, you get better flavor development. The sugar interacts with the yeast better. It gives you better attenuation. And the darker sugars give you flavors that you're not going to be able to get otherwise. Obviously, in the book, I discuss rock candy. And nothing against the people who sell that, but that rock candy is not giving you the same thing. In the case, if you're looking for clear, then everything ends up being sucrose. Any inversion you get you're going to get in the kettle yourself. For the darker sugars, you need to use what the Belgians are using, which has only recently become available in the United States. It's actually a home brewer who started importing a dark syrup, and I don't know. I know that I can say Beer and More Beer is selling it. A few commercial brewers are already beginning to experiment with it. Brian Mercer is the person bringing it in. He now has a pallet coming in of the Casanade, which does a light and darker dry sugar. That's what Rochefort uses, for instance. So those things are available. But going back to brewing like yourself, I live in the Southwest. I can go into places that are selling fresh produce, and they've got different kinds of Mexican sugar, which is an unrefined sugar. You can experiment with those sorts of things, and you'll begin to get flavors that are similar that you like. So it's worth doing a lot of experimenting to see what you can get.
So if you go to the homebrew store and you see the candy with an I sugar, the Belgian candy CANDI sugar, is that substantially different from like the sugar that you bag, the bag of sugar that you buy in the grocery store?
The white sugar?
Yeah.
In your beer, it's not going to make any difference. They now can stock that dark candy sugar, which Brian is spelling with an I, because that's what people are used to.
So look for the good stuff.
Yeah, or you can also use that other sugar, which is going to give you some coloring along with darker malt. Some people are making, homebrewers who are experimenting like crazy have found good recipes. They make these beers well with those recipes, which is, I'm happy to drink them.
Or at least try them, right?
Right.
One of the sacrifices of being the new Belgian beer guy. What do you think are the essential points for a home brewer to remember in brewing one of these beers? I mean, take us to kind of through the process, and what are your secrets to success?
Well, I'd say start simple, as we talked about before, and be willing to fail, but learn along the way. One of the things in doing this book, I before I even went to Belgium, I invited homebrewers to send me their experiences. And many people like to take a batch of beer, split it into two, and ferment it with different yeasts and see what happens. I think that's a good approach, but pick one yeast, for instance, and go with that yeast. You know, consider yourself like the new brewer at Rochefort, and somebody said, "This is your yeast. That's what you're working with." You know, for instance, of all those, we've talked because you can source any of the 4 yeasts used by the Trappist breweries. Personally, I kind of like a Chouffe, which is also from the Ardennes, because it gives a really nice spicy finish. So once you get to have a yeast, that's when you begin experiment. You know, pitch it at 62, let it rise quicker. Pitch it at 66, don't never get above 68, and begin to see what different kinds of characteristics you get working with that yeast. Getting to know your yeast is absolutely essential. And then, particularly if you're doing batch after batch, you'll begin to think about how much you're pitching in there. That's the time to say, I've got viable yeast. I can pitch less. I'll see what kind of flavor development I get. So those sorts of experiments, I think, are what it comes down to. Because the most important thing of these beers is fermentation management.
And take good notes.
And definitely take good notes.
Because it doesn't count if you have a few beers while you're brewing and you don't remember what you did to get your good beer.
and certainly tasting Belgian beers is an essential thing. You know, that's taste and see what you like, and don't automatically assume that strange flavors belong there. You know, we get beers from Belgium that aren't any better than Americans make, and then they get on a boat and come here and get abused at many different levels. You know, but they're undergoing re-fermentation in the bottle. You let the temps get up over 100 with them, and really bad things happen.
You don't know whether the beer's been on a boat or on a truck or where.
Right. So, you know, taste the things and taste with people who understand what it should taste like. Because you know, when you judge in homebrew competitions, you get a lot of beers that people misunderstand what flavors they'll be going for. Or maybe it's a half of ice and the one bad. They say, oh, there's something wrong with this. I went in, or I'll call it Belgian.
Yeah. If you brew a funky beer accidentally, it's a Belgian all of a sudden.
Yeah, but don't, you know, and that's another tricky thing. We're only talking about one small part of the Belgian brewing family.
Right.
You know, you've got the sour beers. You know, this book is the third of a series, and there are some things like wit beer that have not been covered yet.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. Is it going to be you?
No. I don't know that there is going to be one, but I this weekend I was talking to somebody about who's going to work on a proposal for one. It seems sort of singular for an entire book, but you do have the Pierre Celis element, and people would be surprised by the cross section of white beers that have, I guess you would say, returned to Belgium since until Pierre saved the style. It was almost totally gone. And
there's some examples being brewed over here as well. I think Avery is their White Rascal. Have you tried that one?
Yeah, and that's their number 2 selling beer.
It's a wonderful beer.
And, of course, I'm a big fan of the Allagash White.
But Ommegaang's doing a white beer, and Victory Brewing does a very nice, it's called Whirlwind Wit, a very nice beer. And speaking of that, for instance, talking about this particular family of styles, and it's a good place to start because even though fermentation management is not easy, you are not dealing with wild yeast, you are not dealing with spices. And in fact, Victory, which is known for its Hop Devil, its number 2 selling beer is Golden Monkey, which is pretty much of a triple.
So you start with the basics and then move on.
Right. And there's it's a funny thing, and in the end, you can take something that's just a couple malts and the sugar and the yeast, well done fermentation management, and you'll have people guessing what other
ingredients you have in there. Did you put this spice in? Or you must use this particular malt because you're getting this extra bit of tangerine. And what about the hops and those sorts of things? And yet you started with something incredibly simple.
Well, I enjoyed the book, and I enjoyed the conversation.
And it is a weakness of mine. I love talking about these beers.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Well, thanks again to Stan Hieronymus for taking time out to talk to us. Stan will be giving a presentation at the National Homebrewers Conference in Orlando in June on brewing like a monk. And by the way, Steve Wilkes and I have our plane reservations. So if you're going to the National Homebrewers Conference in Orlando, look for us there and come and say howdy if you see us. It should be a lot of fun. And I hope to be drinking some good beers and some good homebrew down there as well, which is beer, you know. Just coffee, I swear. Next week, Tony Simmons, creator of Poor Richard's Ale, talks to us about his recipe and how he brewed a beer that he thinks Ben Franklin would recognize. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And while you're on our site, you can check out our online shop where you can find new pricing on our DVDs and a combo deal to save you even more. In Basic Brewing Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process step by step, from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. And you can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online. And if your local homebrew store doesn't carry our DVDs, maybe you can suggest they can contact me to find out how. Well, that's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson, who's turning 40 this week. Yeah, I know he doesn't listen. He's not a brewer, but happy birthday to Kelly. He's all depressed. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time. So long.